Over the past 12 months, the deflationary downturn caught millions off guard, but my featured guest outlined the details of the current malaise way back in 2002 in his bestseller, Conquer the Crash. Robert Prechter Jr. is founder and president of Elliot Wave International, the world's largest independent financial forecasting firm. Welcome aboard, Robert.
Thanks for having me on Gold Sea.
One of your assistants, Katrina, was talking about snow skiing. You know, we live a couple hours north of the Elliot Wave International's headquarters. You all should organize a weekend ski trip.
I skied once. I think I was 16. Nobody gave me a lesson. I went to the top of the mountain, and when I woke up, I needed crutches for 2 months. See, I stick to water. I'm a water skier, not a snow skier.
Yeah, I enjoy water skiing as well, as long as there's a boat strong enough to pull me up out of the water.
Okay.
Well, let's jump right into your magnum opus here, Conquer the Crash. You discuss how major stock market declines oftentimes lead to depressions. And over the past decade or so, the Dow Jones, somewhat range-bound here, basically treading water in nominal terms. But when we view it from the perspective of real money, sound money, I think those blue chips are starting to have more of a reddish tint to them. Do you view this current economic malaise as a mini depression?
I think we have been in a developing depression ever since about 2001. And the only reason it's not obvious to anyone is because we have fiat money, and there was so much inflation of the credit supply between 2002 and 2005/8 that things look good in nominal terms. They can even claim that the GDP has been improving. But in real terms, at least measured in real money, which is gold, things have been collapsing. The Dow has lost 78% of its value in real money terms. The housing market actually peaked in 2002, I believe it was, if you measure it in gold terms. So we had a bit of a manic speculation period in the middle of the last decade in housing, then in the stock market, and finally in commodities. But I think that's over with. They went to the lowest common denominator of borrower they could possibly find, which is people who are flat broke to buy homes. I think that what we have now is a debt problem that's tremendous. And eventually, just like the much smaller debt problem of 1929, this is going to lead us into a deflationary depression, and we've only been in the early stages.
I'd like to discuss your price to earnings analysis. In your book, you refer to this as pickles to earnings, jokingly pointing out that, you could just as easily substitute pickles as an effective metric. And although Wall Street would disagree, from a contrarian perspective, those high PEs, they actually do forecast trouble ahead for stocks. A more traditional PE ratio would require a big drop in either price or a huge increase in earnings. And, well, given your last scenario you just laid out there, that seems unlikely.
I completely agree. My point was, though, that if you price the value of stocks against a jar of pickles, you would also find right now that either stocks have to come down a whole long way or pickles have to suddenly jump. And I don't think pickles are going to go up for any particular reason. Stocks are overvalued on any measure outside the stock market that you want to use to compare, whether it's dividend payout, earnings that are coming in. In fact, as you know, probably the current PE is the worst ever. There's never been a higher PE ratio. Normally the market, or let's not say normally, in the last century, the market has bottomed when PE is around 7. It's currently over 100 because the E is so low. It could end up going infinite. I think it will in the next leg down because I think earnings are going to disappear. So you're absolutely right, but the one that to me is much more reliable is the dividend payout. At the lows of the last century, dividend payout has usually been about 6.5–7%. That's when people are so worried about capital losses, they want a big dividend payout, and that's how you make a bottom. Well, in the past century, most tops were around the time when we had a 3% yield, which is very, very low. And believe it or not, in 2000, it got down to 1.4% on the Dow. It was the lowest yield by far that we've ever seen in the market. And currently, the yield is 2.9. So it's just where it was in 1929 on the very top day, 1966 on the top day, 1968 on the top day, 1937, all the greatest tops of the last 100 years. That's the current dividend payout, and people think it's a bottom. There's no way.
With over half of Americans, 150 million stockholders, one can't help but wonder if we should change the motto on the dollar to "in stocks we trust." Do you also view this fact as bearish from a contrarian perspective?
Completely. We have it's beginning to melt, a society-wide embrace of this whole idea that we can get rich in the stock market. It's never in history extended to that larger percentage of society. Even in the 20s, I think only about 5 or 10% of people actually speculated. And now, as you point out, it's pushing 2/3 of the whole population, particularly when you include things like pension plans that people are in, and they don't realize that they own the stocks. So it's just historic, and I think it fits. If you look in the earlier chapters of Conquer the Crash, you'll see that we've been making a case ever since my very first book in 1978 that this last great bull market that was due in the 80s and extended through the 90s was the final hurrah, very much like the 1920s. And when it was over, we would retrace the whole thing. And I think that we are following that script. Things took a lot longer than I thought, but the form is exactly the way we expected, and I think the resolution will be as well.
I'd like to move on to the inflation-deflation debate. The inflation camp seems to have the upper hand in this discussion. At least they did until last year. 2008 witnessed a domestic and global deflationary firestorm. It was first seen on Wall Street, and I think you'd agree it spread to Main Street quickly. Even 130-year-old icon Lehman Brothers was one of the more notable victims there. But the largest casualties seem to have been Freddie Mae and Freddie Mac, required the largest bailout in history. Now, despite all these bailouts, about $15 trillion in total, banks they simply don't seem to be lending when we look at the excess reserves at the member banks, and the consumer just seems to have lost his wallet here. What does this foretell for inflation and deflation?
Well, the two main aspects of a turn toward deflation, which, by the way, is very rare. It only happens about once a century, certainly one this large. The first one is psychological, and as you pointed out, the banks are not lending. And most people don't want to borrow anymore. They want to close out their credit cards. They want to get out from under their mortgages. They're walking away from homes. This was a major change in psychology, and the reason I was predicting a major change in psychology was that we were predicting a change in the direction of the stock market. And I think the stock market runs on waves of optimism and pessimism, and the wave of optimism had basically exhausted itself. So now we're in a wave of pessimism. This is when people pull in their horns, they get more conservative, they don't want to expand their businesses anymore, they don't want to expand their houses anymore, they just want to pull in and get more conservative, get safer. So we have this huge secular psychological change, and I don't think that the Fed or even the federal government has the power to change that. Now, the second question is, what about the mechanical ability to pay back debt? I think the cap on this from 2002 to 2008, when people were taking on debt, people who couldn't even afford to pay a down payment on a house were taking possession. That was the last straw. We've now created $50 trillion worth of debt that you can tag quickly. There are probably hundreds of trillions of dollars worth of more of IOUs. People haven't even pinned down how much we have in derivative IOUs, much less Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, and all those other promises of government. We're running on so many IOUs, there's not enough base money to cover even 1 or 2% of all of that. Even though the Fed has created $1 trillion of new money, it's a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of debt that's collapsing and will continue to collapse. And I think the next leg down we'll see that the Fed is powerless against the monster that they helped create, which is the biggest debt load in the history of man. People can't pay their interest, and eventually they won't be able to pay the principal.
Well, speaking of monsters, credit and debt, one of the places where I think economists have been misguided here, too focused on the money supply aspects of price levels and ignored the credit side of that equation. And wasn't credit the grease that kept those inflation cogs running over the past few years? And without that lubricant in place, it seems like there's just nothing left other than deflation to take over.
You